The air in Obsidian 3 didn't just smell like ozone. It felt like a physical weight, a thick metallic soup of industrial exhaust and the lingering scent of processed carbon. My joints ached with every movement, a persistent reminder of the 3 years I spent in the Recon Corps, jumping from low-gravity moons until my cartilage decided to quit. I wiped the counter of the Void's respite with a rag that was more grease than fiber, staring out through the reinforced plexiglass window at the neon-darkness of the lower district. Business was dead. It was always dead at 2100 hours. The curfew for non-prime entities had just kicked in, meaning the streets were now the exclusive playground of the Vanguard drones and the heavy-booted enforcers of the Iron Hand. In this corner of the galaxy, if you weren't made of polished chrome or high Xylos royalty, you were just dust waiting to be swept away. I looked at the clock. 21:15. Right on schedule. I moved to the back of the kitchen, past the humming synthesizers and the bubbling vats of fermenting yeast. I didn't use the automated dispensers for this. I grabbed a ceramic bowl, an antique from old Earth, chipped and worn, and filled it with a thick aromatic broth I'd spent 4 hours simmering. It was a recipe from my grandmother, a heavy blend of root vegetables and spices that didn't exist on this rock, reconstituted from expensive smuggled powders. I opened the back door, the hinges screaming in protest against the biting wind. The temperature outside had plummeted to -10 degrees Celsius, and the obsidian dust, sharp microscopic shards of volcanic glass, swirled in the air like frozen glitter. He was there, huddled in the alcove between two rusted cooling units. Kailas soon looked less like a living being and more like a pile of discarded rags. His skin, once the deep, vibrant indigo of the Xylos highcast, had faded to a dusty, translucent gray. His forearms were tucked tight against his narrow chest, trembling so violently I could hear his chitinous plates clicking together. "Don't just sit there and freeze to death, old man," I grunted, keeping my voice low. "The Vanguard patrols are doubling their rounds tonight. Get inside." The old alien looked up. His 4 eyes, clouded with cataracts that looked like swirling nebulae, blinked slowly. He didn't move at first, his neural dampeners likely jammed by the cold. I reached down, my muscular forearms tensing as I hoisted him up. He weighed almost nothing. His bones were becoming porous, a symptom of the wasting that hit his species when they were cut off from their home star's radiation. "Your kindness is a tactical error, Cyrus Vane," Kalis rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. His translator, a primitive piece of tech strapped to his throat with frayed wires, sparked intermittently. "Yeah, well, I've made a career out of tactical errors," I replied, ushering him into the warmth of the kitchen. I locked the door and slid the heavy iron bolt home. "Sit, eat, before I change my mind and turn you into the authorities for the 5-credit bounty." Kalis settled into a wooden chair, his movements stiff and agonizing. He took the bowl with trembling hands, the steam rising to meet his weathered face. For a moment he just inhaled, his primary eyes closing in what I assumed was a Xylos prayer, or perhaps just pure, unadulterated relief. "Pepper pot," he whispered, the translator struggling with the Earth-specific term. "The heat is efficient." "It's more than efficient," I said, leaning against the counter and lighting a synthetic cigar. "It's family. My old man used to say that if you can't fix a problem with a hot meal, the problem isn't worth fixing." Kalis took a sip, his throat working hard to swallow. "Your old man was an optimist. The problems of Obsidian 3 require more than soup, Cyrus. They require a reckoning." I watched him eat, a strange sense of protective anger simmering in my gut. On this planet helping a gray ghost, a Xylos who had been stripped of their aura script and declared legally dead, was a one-way ticket to a labor camp. The Iron Hand, under the command of that psychopath Valthor, didn't believe in charity. They believed in functional purity. If you weren't contributing to the mining output, you were a drain on the life support systems, and drains were meant to be plugged. "You're a high arbiter, aren't you?" I asked suddenly. I'd suspected it for weeks. The way he carried himself, even in rags. The way he spoke with a rhythmic cadence that suggested he used to command thousands. Kalis paused, a spoonful of broth halfway to his mouth. I am a shadow, Cyrus, nothing more. Shadows don't have military-grade neural dampeners embedded in their skulls, I countered, pointing to the faint glowing ridge behind his ear. And they don't know my full name. I never told you my last name was Vane. The old alien's eyes sharpened, the cataracts momentarily cleared by a surge of internal energy. For a heartbeat, the frail beggar vanished, and I saw the man who had once stood at the right hand of the core coalition. I know many things, Recon Scout, he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the static of the translator. I know why you left the service. I know about the incident at the Helios Gate, and I know that you are the only human on this entire God's-forsaken rock who still possesses a soul that hasn't been digitized. I opened my mouth to tell him to shut up, to take his soup and go back to his hole, but a sound from the street stopped me. It was the low, rhythmic hum of high-performance graviton engines, not the clunky, screaming whine of the worker shuttles. This was the smooth, predatory purr of the Vanguard's elite. I moved to the front of the bar, staying in the shadows. Two black armored transport, sleek and terrifying like obsidian knives, pulled up to the curb. There were no lights, no sirens, just the silent, terrifying efficiency of a professional hit. Frag, I hissed, reaching under the bar for the pulse pistol I kept taped to the underside of the oak. They're here. Kalis didn't panic. He slowly finished his soup, set the bowl down with a gentle click, and stood up. He looked taller than he had a minute ago. Cyrus, he said, his four eyes fixed on the front door, whatever happens next, do not lie to them. They already know the truth. They are just looking for an excuse to pull the trigger. The door didn't just open. It was vaporized. A concentrated thermal charge blew the lock out in a shower of white-hot sparks. 4 Vanguard troopers stormed in, their silver and black armor gleaming under the flickering neon. They moved with the synchronized grace of a single machine, their rifles already leveled at my chest. Then he stepped in. Commander Valthor was a man who had replaced 60% of his body with high-tensile polymers and neural link combat systems. His face was a mask of cold, unexpressive synth skin, save for a single glowing red optic that scanned the room with terrifying speed. Cyrus Vane, Valthor said, his voice a synthesized baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. You have been found in violation of the Silence Decree, subsection 4, aiding an unregistered non-prime. I didn't lower my pistol. He's an old man, Valthor. He was shivering in the dirt. Is compassion a crime now? Compassion is a biological defect, Valthor replied, his red eye locking onto Kalis, who stood calmly by the kitchen door. One that has cost the human species its seat at the high table. You are hereby stripped of your business license and scheduled for immediate extraction to the pit. One of the troopers stepped forward, heavy restraints rattling at his belt. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Commander, Kalis spoke up. The troopers froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the authority behind them. Kalis soon stepped into the light, and for the first time, he didn't hide the ridge behind his ear. He tapped a sequence into the skin, and a holographic seal erupted into the air between them. It was a golden sunburst laced with intricate Xylos geometry, the Arbiter's seal. Valthor's red eye flickered. For the first time in his augmented life, the commander hesitated. Hi, Arbiter Kalis. You were executed 3 cycles ago. The reports of my death were, as the humans say, a tactical exaggeration, Kalis said, walking toward Valthor with a steady gait. He looked at the troopers, and they actually lowered their weapons. And if you touch this human, I will personally see to it that your neural link is fried by a priority 1 override code that I still carry in my primary cortex. Valthor's metal hands clenched into fists. You are a traitor to the Xylos state. You have no authority here. I have the authority of the source, Kalis countered. And right now, I am hungry, tired, and very unimpressed with your hospitality. Leave us. Valthor stared at him for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was so thick I could almost taste it. Then with a sharp, mechanical click of his neck joint, Valthor turned around. This isn't over, Arbiter, the commander hissed. You can hide behind your codes for now. But the Iron Hand is coming for the girl. And once we have Lyra, your seal won't be worth the light it's projected on. The Vanguard retreated as quickly as they had arrived. The black transports roared to life and vanished into the obsidian dust. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the old alien, who was now leaning heavily against the bar, his brief surge of power clearly exhausted. "Who the hell are you, Kalis?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me with those ancient, tired eyes. "I am the man who is going to get you killed, Cyrus, unless you help me save my daughter." Silence reclaimed the void's respite, but it wasn't the comfortable, empty silence of a slow night. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes an orbital bombardment. I stared at the scorched ruins of my front door, the smell of burnt wiring stinging my nostrils. 5 years of hard work, 5 years of trying to be a ghost in a machine city, gone in a single thermal blast. I turned to Kalis. He had slumped back into the chair, his gray skin looking even more ashen than before. The holographic seal had vanished, leaving only the dim, flickering neon of the bar's open sign to light his face. "You've got 30 seconds to explain why the most dangerous man on this planet just walked out of here without putting a hole in my head," I said, holstering my pistol but keeping my hand near the grip. Kalis coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Valthor is a creature of protocols, Cyrus. He is augmented to follow the chain of command. As long as my Arbiter seal is active in the Coalition's database, he cannot legally harm me or anyone under my direct protection without a signed warrant from the High Council. And how long until he gets that warrant? On Obsidian 3? The bureaucracy is slow even for the Iron Hand. Perhaps 48 hours. Perhaps less if he can find a corrupt councilman to bypass the filters. So we have 2 days before we're both KIA, I muttered, moving to the bar and pouring 2 glasses of my strongest synthetic rye. I pushed one toward him. "Drink it, it'll cauterize the nerves." Kalis took a sip and winced. "Humans, you find pleasure in the strangest poisons." "It's the only thing that keeps the dust from settling in our lungs," I replied, knocking mine back in one go. The liquid burned like liquid fire, but it cleared the fog in my brain. "Now talk to me about the girl. Lyra, Valthor mentioned her." Kalis sighed, his secondary eyes drooping. "Lyra Zun, my daughter. She is the high negotiator for the core coalition. She's currently stationed at the Obsidian Spire, trying to prevent Valthor from turning this entire sector into a forced labor camp for non-prime species." "She's a diplomat? Then why is she in danger? Diplomatic immunity is the only thing this planet respects besides a plasma rifle." "Atum, because she has found something she wasn't supposed to," Kalis whispered, leaning forward. "There is a reason the human population on Obsidian 3 has dropped by 40% in the last 3 months. It wasn't just voluntary relocation to the outer colonies, Cyrus." My stomach did a slow roll. "I've heard the rumors. People disappearing from the slums, shuttles taking off at midnight from the black sites. I thought it was just Valthor being a prick." "It is worse," Kalis said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "Valthor is running a project called Operation Purification. He isn't just deporting humans, he's using them. Your species has a unique neural architecture, a high tolerance for emotional variance. Valthor discovered that he can harvest human aura data to power the neural nets of the Vanguard drones. It makes them more intuitive, more lethal." I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the outside wind. "He's using us as batteries? For his war machines?" "Essentially. Lyra found the data logs. She's trying to smuggle the evidence out of the Spire to the Galactic Council. But Valthor has her trapped. He's cut off her communications, claiming there's a security breach in her quarters." I paced the length of the bar, my boots crunching on the shattered glass. "And let me guess, you want me to break into the most heavily guarded building on the planet, rescue a high negotiator, and steal the evidence of a genocide, all while being hunted by a cyborg with a god complex?" "I would not ask if there were any other way," Kalis said softly. "But you are a recon scout. You know the maintenance tunnels. You know how to move through the shadows of the lower district. And most importantly, you are human. The security sensors in the Spire are tuned to detect Xylos biosignatures. A human can slip through the blind spots in their logic. It's a suicide mission, Kalis. It is a mission for a purpose, Cyrus Vane. the old alien countered, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me look away. For 3 years you have sat in this bar and watched the world rot. You have tried to forget the soldier you were because you didn't like the orders you had to follow. But this is an order from your own soul. Will you stand by while your brothers and sisters are turned into fuel for the machine that will eventually kill us all? I looked at the void's respite. It was a dump, a graveyard for my ambitions. I looked at my hands, scarred, calloused, and stained with the grease of 1,000 broken machines. I don't do this for free, I said, though we both knew it was a lie. I can offer you something Valthor cannot, Kayla said, reaching into the folds of his rags and pulling out a small, glowing data shard. This is a bypass key for the Helios Gate. It contains the navigation codes to a colony ship that left Earth 6 months ago, a ship that is currently hiding in the Oort cloud of a neighboring system. If we succeed, I can give you the coordinates. You can leave this rock. You can be with your own kind again. The thought of Earth, or even just a ship full of humans who weren't being used as batteries, sent a jolt through me that was stronger than the rye. How do we get into the spire? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Kalis offered a thin, xylose smile. We don't go through the front door. We go through the hush order vents. But first, we need to visit an old friend of mine in the scrapyards, a man they call the Tinker. I grabbed my heavy combat jacket from the hook behind the bar and checked the charge on my pulse pistol. It was at 80%. Not enough for a war, but enough to start one. We leave in 10 minutes, I said. And Kalis? Yes, Cyrus? If we die tonight, I'm going to find your ghost in the afterlife and make you drink a gallon of that synthetic rye. The old Arbiter chuckled, a dry, papery sound. A fair bargain, human. A fair bargain indeed. We stepped out into the biting cold of Obsidian 3. The neon lights of the city above us felt like cold, unblinking eyes, watching our every move. But for the first time in years, the metallic air didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a challenge. As we moved into the shadows of the alley, the hum of the Vanguard patrols echoed in the distance. The Iron Hand was knocking, but for once, I wasn't going to hide behind the bar. I was going to answer. The scrapyards of Obsidian 3 were a cathedral of rust and forgotten dreams. Great mountains of jagged metal, some reaching 20 meters into the smog-choked sky, groaned under the weight of their own decay. It was a landscape of tectonic industrial waste where the discarded technology of 1,000 civilizations came to die. As Kalis and I navigated the narrow canyons between the heaps, the smell of oxidizing iron and old hydraulic fluid was so thick it felt like I was inhaling the past. Every few minutes, a distant crash echoed through the gloom, another avalanche of scrap settling in the wind. Watch your six, Kalis, I whispered, my hand resting on the hilt of my pulse pistol. This place is crawling with scav rats and desperate meat sacks who'd peel the skin off your back for a handful of copper wiring. The old alien nodded, his forearms tucked tightly into his tattered cloak. His breathing was labored, a rhythmic wheezing that suggested the cold was finally winning the war against his lungs. Despite his frailty, he moved with a strange, deliberate grace, his four eyes scanning the horizon for the subtle flickers of movement that betrayed a hidden predator. The Tinker lives in the belly of a downed freighter, Kalis rasped. The ship was called the Solaris 9. It's been here since the first mining riots 30 years ago. We passed a group of human refugees huddled around a fire made of burning synthetic tires. The smoke was black and toxic, but they didn't seem to care. They were the ones the Iron Hand had overlooked so far, the ones too broken to be useful as batteries and too poor to be worth the effort of deportation. A young girl, maybe no more than 7 years old, stared at me with eyes that had seen too much for a single lifetime. She was holding a doll made of scrap metal and frayed wires. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a protein bar I'd been saving. I tossed it to her. She caught it with the reflexes of a street urchin and vanished into the shadows of a rusted hull before her parents could even look up. That bar cost you 5 credits, Cyrus, Kalis observed quietly. Credits don't buy a soul, old man, I grunted, turning a corner into a wider clearing. They just buy you a slightly more comfortable cage. The Solaris 9 was a massive, hulking carcass of a ship, its once white hull now a mosaic of orange rust and graffiti. It was wedged between two slag heaps, its nose buried deep in the frozen mud. The main airlock had been replaced by a heavy blast door of reinforced steel, adorned with the skeletal remains of various droids. I hammered on the door with the butt of my pistol, a rhythmic sequence. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short, the old recon code for friendly contact. A small camera eye slid out from a concealed slot above the door. It whirred and clicked, its lens zooming in on my face. "Sit rep is green, Vex," I barked at the camera. "Open the damn hatch before the Vanguard catch our scent." The door groaned and hissed, a cloud of pressurized steam erupting from the seals. As it swung open, the interior of the ship was revealed, a chaotic workshop filled with the hum of soldering irons and the soft blue glow of holographic displays. Standing in the center of the room was a creature that was more machine than man, though the distinction was purely academic in the scrapyards. He was a heavily modified industrial droid, an old Mark IV loader, but his head had been replaced with a cluster of sensory arrays and a single expressive optical sensor that glowed a soft amber. This was Sarge 5, a sentient AI that claimed to be the digital reincarnation of a legendary human drill sergeant I'd served under years ago. "Vane, you old dog face," Sarge 5's voice boomed through a cracked speaker. "I thought you'd kicked the bucket in that tavern of yours. And you brought a Xylos? My sensors must be glitching, because that looks like a high-caste noble in a beggar's coat." "He's an Arbiter, Sarge," I said, stepping inside and pulling Kalis with me. "And we're in a world of trouble. The Iron Hand is hunting him, and they've already turned my bar into a smoking hole in the ground." Sarge 5's optical sensor dimmed. "Valthor? That bucket of bolts has been getting too big for his britches lately. He's been sending his scav drones into my territory, looking for excess materials. If he finds out I'm harboring you two, he'll turn this freighter into a coffin." "We need a way into the spire," Kalis said, stepping forward and removing his hood. His 4 eyes held a steady, commanding gaze. "We need to reach Lyra Zun." The droid let out a sound like grinding gears. "The spire? Are you foobar? That place is locked down tighter than a Martian vault. Even the ghosts avoid the spire." "Cyrus says you can get us through the hush order vents," Kalis continued. "You have the schematics of the original ventilation system, from before the Iron Hand upgraded the security." Sarge 5 turned his amber eye toward me. "You're asking for a lot, Vane. That vent run is 5 kilometers of vertical climbing through rotating fans and thermal sensors. One slip, and you're just a smear of red paste on a filter." "I know the risks, Sarge," I said, leaning against a workbench covered in disassembled pulse rifles. "But they're using people. Humans. They're stripping our neural nets to power the Vanguard. If we don't stop Valthor, there won't be anyone left to scavenge your scrap." The droid went silent for a moment, the cooling fans in his chest plate whirring as he processed the information. I watched a small mechanical spider scuttle across the floor, carrying a single glowing capacitor. In the scrapyards, everything was repurposed. Everything had a second life. I wondered if the same could be said for us. "I spent 20 years taking orders from meat sacks who didn't know their exhaust from their intake," Sarge 5 finally said. "But you, Vane, you always had a way of finding the most inconvenient truths." He moved to a large table and projected a 3-dimensional map of the obsidian spire. It was a terrifying structure, a jagged needle of black glass and steel that pierced the upper atmosphere. The map showed a network of thin, blue lines snaking through the core of the building. "The vents," Sarge 5 pointed out with a mechanical finger. "They were designed for Xylos biology, high oxygen, low humidity. As a human, your lungs are going to feel like they're being sandpapered. And the old man? His biosigns are already redlining." "I'll make it," Kalis said firmly. "My daughter's in that tower. I am not leaving this rock until she is safe." Sarge 5 looked at the old alien, then back at me. "I've got some old stealth shrouds in the back. They won't make you invisible, but they'll confuse the thermal sensors for at least 45 minutes. After that, you're on your own." He reached into a drawer and pulled out 2 small, sleek devices. They look like oversized wristwatches. "These are Cortex jammers. If a drone gets too close, you trigger these. It'll scramble their logic for 10 seconds. Use them wisely. I only have 2 left." "Thanks, Sarge," I said, taking the devices. What do I owe you? Survival, the droid replied. If you make it back, you're going to help me fix my primary cooling loop. It's been leaking for a decade, and I'm tired of smelling like a burnt circuit board. Deal, I said, offering a small smile. We spent the next hour prepping. I cleaned and oiled my pistol, while Kalis meditated in a corner, his four hands moving in rhythmic patterns as if he were weaving unseen threads of energy. I watched him, wondering what it was like to be a high arbiter, to have the power of life and death over entire sectors, only to end up hiding in a junk heap with a disgraced soldier. Cyrus, Kalis called out, his eyes still closed. Why did you really leave the recon corps? Valthor said you were a hero at the Helios Gate. I stiffened. The Helios Gate was a memory I'd tried to drown in 1,000 bottles of synthetic rye. I can still see the faces of the settlers. We were supposed to protect them. But the orders changed. The coalition decided the planet was too valuable to share with the local Xylos tribes. They told us to clear the sector. And you refused, Kalis stated. I didn't just refuse. I burned the bridge behind us so the reinforcements couldn't get through. I saved 300 Xylos' lives that day, and I cost the coalition 4 billion credits in mining rights. They didn't court-martial me because they didn't want the story getting out. They just retired me with a clean record and a permanent black mark on my soul. Kalis opened his eyes. You chose a life over a law, Cyrus. That is the definition of an arbiter. No, I said, standing up and checking the power cell on my jacket. That's just being a man who's tired of being a cog. Sarge 5 led us to a hidden elevator at the back of the freighter. It descended deep into the bedrock of Obsidian 3, following an old mining shaft that had been forgotten by time. The air grew colder, the pressure increasing as we went deeper. This shaft leads to the base of the spire, Sarge 5 explained. You'll have to climb the last 200 meters through the emergency drainage pipes. From there, you'll find the entrance to the hush order vents. The elevator came to a grinding halt. Sarge 5 pulled a heavy lever, and a small maintenance hatch opened into a dark, damp tunnel. Good luck, Vane, the droid said. Try not to die. It's bad for morale. Always the optimist, Sarge, I replied. Kalis and I stepped into the tunnel. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of water and the distant hum of the planet's core. We were moving into the heart of the enemy, armed with nothing but a broken pistol, a dying alien, and a shred of hope that was getting thinner with every step. As we began the long climb, I thought about the little girl in the scrapyards. She was the reason I was doing this. Not for the credits, not for the coordinates to a human ship, and not even for Kalis. I was doing it because in a world made of rust and obsidian, someone had to remind the machines that we weren't just parts to be replaced. We were the ones who built the stars, and we were the only ones who could keep them burning. The emergency drainage pipes were a nightmare of slime and vertical drops. Every movement was a battle against gravity and the slick, oily residue that coated the interior of the shafts. I led the way, my boots finding purchase on the rusted rungs of an ancient maintenance ladder that felt like it would snap at any moment. Below me, Kalis climbed with agonizing slowness, his four hands grasping the rungs with a desperation that made my own lungs ache in sympathy. We reached the primary junction after what felt like hours of climbing. The air here was different, cleaner but also colder. We were beneath the spire now, the massive foundation of the building humming with the power of a dozen fusion reactors. The hush order vents, Kalis whispered, pointing toward a small circular opening guarded by a heavy iron grate. I pulled a laser cutter from my belt and made quick work of the bolts. The grate fell away with a muffled clang, revealing a narrow tunnel of polished chrome. This was the spire's circulatory system, the pipes that carried the chilled air to the upper levels where the elite silos lived in climate-controlled luxury. I climbed inside first, the space so tight my shoulders brushed against both walls. The sound of my own breathing echoed back at me, a rhythmic reminder of my own mortality. Kalis followed, his slender frame sliding into the vent with surprising ease. 45 minutes, I reminded him, activating the stealth shroud on my wrist. If we're not at Lyra's quarters by then, every sensor in this building is going to start screaming. The climb was relentless. We bypassed the massive cooling fans, their blades spinning with a terrifying low-frequency hum that vibrated through my bones. We crawled past thermal sensors that glowed with a faint, crimson light, our shrouds flickering as they fought to mask our heat signatures. As we moved higher, the sounds of the spire began to seep through the vents. I heard the muffled voices of bureaucrats, the rhythmic clicking of automated scribes, and the distant, haunting melodies of Xylos opera. It was a world of absolute order, a stark contrast to the chaotic survival of the scrapyards below. We reached level 82, the diplomatic quarter. Kalis tapped my ankle. "Here," he signaled. I checked the small holographic display on my wrist. According to Sarge 5's map, this vent opened into a private library adjacent to Lyrazun's living quarters. I pressed my ear against the vent cover. Silence. I slowly unscrewed the fasteners and pushed the cover aside. I dropped into the room, my boots landing softly on a thick plush carpet that felt like walking on a cloud. The library was magnificent, filled with thousands of physical books, a rare luxury in the digital age, and artifacts from across the galaxy. Kalis dropped down beside me, his 4 eyes wide as he looked around the room. "This was her favorite place," he whispered. "She used to spend hours here, reading about the ancient civilizations of Earth." A door at the far end of the library slid open. I raised my pistol, my finger tightening on the trigger. A Xylos woman stepped into the room. She was breathtaking, even by human standards. Her skin was a vibrant, shimmering lavender, and her 4 eyes were a deep, intelligent violet. She wore a long, flowing robe of silver silk that seemed to catch the light from the holographic stars projected on the ceiling. She froze when she saw me, her hands instinctively moving toward a small communication device on her belt. "Lyra," Kalis said, stepping out of the shadows. The woman's violet eyes widened. Her hands began to tremble, and for a moment, the poised diplomat vanished, replaced by a daughter who had seen a ghost. "Father?" she whispered, her voice a melody of disbelief. "But the reports. Valthor said you were dead. He said you died in the mining riots." "Valthor lies about many things, Lyra," Kalis said, walking toward her. He embraced her with all 4 arms, and for a long minute, the only sound in the room was the soft sobbing of a woman who had finally found her anchor. I stood back, feeling like an intruder in a moment that was too private for a man like me. I kept my eyes on the door, my ears straining for the sound of Vanguard boots. "Who is this?" Lyra asked, pulling back and looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "A human? In the spire?" "He is Cyrus Vane," Kalis said, gesturing toward me. "He saved my life, Lyra, and he is the reason I am here." Lyra studied me, her gaze penetrating and cold. "You are a soldier," she stated. "I can see it in the way you stand. You are a man who is used to violence." "I'm a man who's used to reality," I countered. "And right now the reality is that we have about 20 minutes before the Vanguard find out we're here. Do you have the evidence?" Lyra's expression hardened. Her diplomatic mask snapped back into place. "Yes, I have the data logs from the Black Site. Valthor is using the human refugees for a project he calls synaptic integration. He's not just harvesting their data, he's overwriting their personalities to create a new breed of Vanguard drone. One that is devoid of empathy but possesses human tactical intuition." "It's worse than we thought," Kalis murmured. "We need to get this to the council," Lyra said, moving to a small concealed safe behind a row of books. She pulled out a small glowing data crystal. "This contains the names of the victims, the locations of the harvesting facilities, and Valthor's personal authorization codes. It's enough to strip him of his command and put him on trial for war crimes. But we have to get out of here first," I reminded her. "The vents are out. They'll be watching them now that we've bypassed the sensors once." "There is a private shuttle bay on level 96, Lyra said. "It's used for diplomatic emergencies. I have the clearance codes to launch a transport, but we have to cross the main atrium to get there." The main atrium was the heart of the spire, a massive open space filled with guards, cameras, and the elite of Obsidian 3. "It was the most dangerous route we could take. Then we better look like we belong there," I said. Lyra looked at my battered jacket and grease-stained pants. "You look like a scav rat, Mr. Vane, but I have an idea." 10 minutes later, I was wearing a stiff, uncomfortable uniform of a Spire security guard. It was a size too small, the fabric pinching my shoulders, but the helmet concealed my face, and the tinted visor masked my human eyes. Kailas was hidden inside a large, automated luggage cart that Lyra was pushing with practiced ease. We stepped into the main atrium. The scale of the place was staggering. The ceiling was a dome of transparent glass, revealing the swirling black clouds of the upper atmosphere. Massive statues of Xylo's heroes lined the walls, and the floor was a mosaic of precious gems that glittered under the artificial suns. Dozens of Xylo's nobles moved through the space, their robes rustling like dry leaves. Vanguard troopers stood at every exit, their silver armor gleaming. I kept my head down, my hand resting on the holster of the guard-issue pulse rifle I'd taken from Lyra's armory. "Stay calm," Lyra whispered as we approached the elevator bank. "Just keep moving." We were halfway to the elevators when a voice boomed across the atrium. "Deputy Minister Lyra!" We stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned slowly, my finger hovering near the trigger. Approaching us was a tall, slender Xylos male with skin the color of polished jade. He wore a robe of deep crimson, and his 4 eyes were narrowed in suspicion. This was High Counselor Dren, one of Valthor's closest political allies. "Counselor Dren," Lyra said, her voice smooth and untroubled. "I wasn't aware you were still in the spire." "I could ask you the same, Lyra," Dren replied, his gaze flickering toward the luggage cart, and then to me. "And why are you transporting your own luggage? Where are your servants?" "My servants are currently undergoing efficiency training at Valthor's request," Lyra lied effortlessly. "And I have a late-night negotiation with the Merlian Trade Syndicate. I didn't want to be disturbed." Dren stepped closer, his scent, a sickly sweet aroma of fermented lilies, filling the air. "And this guard? He seems unfamiliar." "I know most of the Spire detail. He's a new transfer from the Upper District," Lyra said, "a specialist in diplomatic protection." Dren looked at me, his eyes lingering on the way the uniform strained against my chest. He moved his hand toward my helmet as if to lift the visor. "Is there a problem, Counselor?" I asked, my voice muffled by the helmet's vocoder. I made sure to use the sharp, clipped tone of a Vanguard officer. "We have a schedule to maintain." Dren froze. His eyes widened slightly at the insolence. "You speak out of turn, Trooper." "I speak for the safety of the Deputy Minister," I countered. "Unless you have an official warrant to delay us, I suggest you step aside." Dren's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a siren began to wail throughout the atrium. The lights flickered, turning a harsh, strobing red. "Security breach," an automated voice announced. "All personnel, Level 1 lockdown initiated." Dren looked around in confusion. Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handle of the luggage cart and pushed past him, heading for the elevators. "Move!" she hissed at me. We scrambled into the elevator just as the doors began to slide shut. Dren was shouting something, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the security systems. The elevator began its rapid ascent toward level 96. "How did they find us?" I asked, tearing the helmet off and gasping for air. The stealth shroud should have lasted longer. "It wasn't the shroud," Kayla said, climbing out of the luggage cart. He looked exhausted, his primary eyes glazed with pain. "It was the Arbiter seal. When I used it in the tavern, it left a digital footprint. Valthor's technicians must have finally traced the signal to this location." We reached the shuttle bay. It was a wide, circular platform overlooking the city. A single, sleek diplomatic transport sat in the center, its engines already humming as it prepared for its nightly maintenance cycle. 2 Vanguard troopers were guarding the entrance. They saw us and raised their rifles. "Halt!" one of them shouted. "Identify yourselves!" I didn't give them a chance. I drew my pistol and fired 2 shots. The pulse bolts caught them in the chest plates, sending them flying backward. They weren't dead. The pistol was set to stun, but they wouldn't be getting up for a while. Lyra ran to the shuttle's control panel, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. The hatch hissed open. "Get inside," she yelled. We boarded the shuttle. The interior was luxurious, filled with soft leather seats and gold-trimmed displays. I took the pilot's seat, my hands finding the controls with the familiarity of a man who had spent half his life in the cockpit. "I'm locking the coordinates for the Galactic Council Station," Lyra said, sitting in the co-pilot seat. "It's a 3-hour jump. Once we're in hyperspace, Valthor can't touch us. I gripped the flight sticks. Hold on. This is going to be a rough departure. I slammed the throttles forward. The shuttle roared to life, the graviton engines screaming as they fought against the spire's docking clamps. With a violent jolt, we broke free, the ship plunging into the black clouds of Obsidian 3. I looked at the sensor screen. 4 Vanguard interceptors were already closing in, their weapons locking onto our signature. Cyrus, Kalis said, leaning against the doorway of the cockpit. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, old man, I said, banking the ship hard to the left as a plasma bolt streaked past the cockpit. We still have to make it out of the atmosphere. As I navigated the ship through the storm, I realized that for the first time since the Helios Gate, I wasn't running away. I was running towards something. I was a soldier again, but this time, the orders were mine. We were 3 different species, from 3 different worlds, but in that moment, we were the only thing standing between a world of order and a galaxy of light. The thin line between right and wrong had never been clearer. It wasn't about the laws we followed, it was about the lives we saved. I pushed the engines to their limit, and as the black clouds of Obsidian 3 began to thin, I saw the stars. They were waiting for us, and for the first time in a long time, I believed we might actually reach them. The shuttle groaned, a discordant symphony of stressed alloy and failing dampeners, as we breached the inner atmosphere. Outside the viewport, the obsidian clouds of Obsidian 3 were no longer just a backdrop. They were a predatory sea, churning with electrical discharges that licked at our hull like tongues of white fire. I gripped the flight sticks until my knuckles turned a ghostly white, my eyes darting between the failing sensor array and the 4 crimson blips closing in on our 6. "We're losing the port stabilizer!" Lyra shouted over the roar of the wind. Her violet eyes were fixed on a cascading list of red error codes. "The graviton engines are overheating. If we don't hit the jump point in the next 3 minutes, the atmospheric pressure will crush us into a soda can." "I'm working on it," I barked, kicking the rudder and sending the ship into a gut-wrenching spiral to dodge a streak of blue plasma. The bolt missed us by less than 5 meters, the heat from the near miss rattling the cockpit. "Sarge warned me this bucket was built for diplomacy, not a dogfight. We need more juice to the rear shields." Kalis Sun was strapped into the jump seat behind us, his 4 hands clutching the armrests. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate, his eyes closed as he murmured a low-frequency Xylos chant. "The source does not recognize shields, Cyrus. It only recognizes intent." "Well, tell the source that my intent is to not get vaporized by Valthor's goons." I grunted, slamming a heavy toggle on the overhead console. "Lyra, give me a sit rep on the interceptors. Are they backing off?" "Negative," she replied, her voice tight with a newfound fear. "They're not firing to kill anymore. They're aiming for our engines. They want us alive, Cyrus. They want the data shard." "Too bad," I said, eyeing a massive vortex in the clouds below. The maw of the low-light sector. It was a place where the planet's magnetic fields were so distorted that most sensors went blind. It was a pilot's graveyard, but right now it was our only chance. "Hang on, we're going down." "Cyrus, no!" Lyra gasped. "The low-light sector is a dead zone. No one survives a crash in the dark side." "We're not crashing," I lied, pulling the nose down and cutting the primary thrusters. "We're just taking the scenic route." The shuttle plummeted. The world outside turned from dark gray to absolute, terrifying black. Gravity became a physical weight, pressing me into my seat as we dived into the maw. Behind us, the crimson blips of the Vanguard interceptors hesitated, their logic-driven pilots unwilling to risk their multi-million credit ships in a blind descent. For 10 seconds, we were weightless, falling through a void where even the stars felt like a distant memory. Then, the sensors screamed. "Ground proximity! 50 meters! 40! 30! Sarge 5's voice cracked through the ship's internal comms. A gift he'd left me in the software. "Pull up, you meat-headed flyboy! Pull up!" I hauled back on the sticks with every ounce of strength in my arms. The graviton engines flared in a desperate, screaming protest, pushing against the bedrock of Obsidian 3. We didn't land. We bounced. The first impact shattered the landing gear and sent a shower of sparks through the cockpit. The second impact tore off the port wing. The third was a long, grinding slide through a field of jagged obsidian glass that sounded like the screams of 1,000 dying machines. Then there was silence. I slumped forward, my forehead resting on the cool metal of the control yoke. Everything hurt. My ribs felt like they'd been rearranged by a heavy-duty loader, and there was a warm trickle of blood running down my temple. I coughed, the air in the cabin smelling of ozone and burnt insulation. "Lyra," I rasped, my voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. I'm here," she whispered. I looked over to see her slumped in her seat, her lavender skin bruised and her silver robes torn. She was shaking, but her eyes were alert. "Father?" "I remain," Kayla said from the back. He sounded weaker, his voice a mere thread of sound. "Though I believe my skeletal structure has some strong objections to your landing technique, Cyrus." "It's called a controlled descent, old man," I grunted, unstrapping myself and falling out of the seat. My legs were shaky, but they held. I grabbed a medical kit from the wall and tossed a stim patch to Lyra. "Fix yourself up. We can't stay here. The Vanguard will have our coordinates within 20 minutes, even in this soup." I forced the manual override on the hatch. It didn't budge. I had to kick it 3 times before the crumpled metal gave way, hissing as it opened into the freezing night. The low-light sector was even worse than the legends. It was a world of sharp angles and absolute shadows. The only light came from the distant, dim glow of the planet's aurora, casting long, eerie green ribbons across the landscape of volcanic glass. It looked like a graveyard for giants. "Where are we?" Lyra asked, stepping out into the biting cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, her breath coming in white plumes. "According to the last sensor sweep, we're near the Sector 7 intake facility," I said, checking my pulse pistol. The charge was down to 40%. "It's a massive underground complex that handles the geothermal cooling for the spire. If we can find a way in, we might be able to use their long-range comms to bypass Valthor's jammer." We began to trek across the glass fields. Every step was a gamble. The obsidian shards were as sharp as razors, capable of slicing through a boot sole in seconds. Kalis struggled, his 4 hands grasping at the air as he tried to maintain his balance. I ended up draping one of his arms over my shoulder, half carrying the old Arbiter through the dark. "You're doing a lot for a man you barely know, Cyrus Vane," Kalis whispered as we crested a ridge of black rock. "Don't make it a thing, Kalis," I replied, my eyes scanning the horizon. "I just hate seeing good soup go to waste." We reached the intake facility an hour later. It was a brutalist fortress of gray concrete and steel, half buried in the side of a cliff. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the deep subsonic thrum of massive turbines spinning deep underground. "Something's wrong," Lyra said, stopping at the edge of the perimeter fence. "This is a Level 3 government facility. There should be a full garrison of Vanguard troopers here. It's completely dark." "Maybe they're all at my bar looking for us," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. I moved to the main gate and found the control panel. It had been smashed, the wires ripped out with a violence that suggested a struggle. Or maybe someone else got here first. I used my laser cutter to burn through the lock. The gate swung open with a mournful groan. We moved into the courtyard, the silence pressing in on us like a physical weight. As we approached the main entrance, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of ozone or metal. It was a smell I knew from the Helios gate. The smell of fear, stale sweat, and something chemical. The smell of a hospital that had been turned into a prison. "Stay behind me," I told them, my pistol raised. We entered the facility. The interior was a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, the walls lined with heavy-duty cables that pulsed with a faint blue light. We followed the cables, the hum of the machinery growing louder as we descended into the lower levels. We rounded a corner and stopped dead. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, a processing bay. But instead of geothermal equipment, the room was filled with hundreds of glass cylinders. Each cylinder was filled with a translucent amber fluid. And inside each cylinder was a human being. "Oh, Source," Lyra whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. They were refugees from the slums. I recognized some of them. A man who used to sell roasted nuts near the spaceport. A woman who had once helped me fix my jukebox. They were suspended in the fluid, their eyes closed, their bodies connected to a web of glowing fibers that were plugged directly into their spinal columns. A central holographic display in the middle of the room showed a scrolling list of data. Subject, 442, species, human, neural variance, high, output, 22 kilowatts, status, integrating. They're being drained, I said, my voice trembling with a rage I hadn't felt in a decade. I walked over to one of the tanks. The man inside looked peaceful, but his skin was a sickly, translucent white, and his heart was beating with a slow, mechanical rhythm. Valthor isn't just using their data. He's using their life force. Their actual consciousness is being stripped away to act as a buffer for the Vanguard's combat logic. It's a neural slaughterhouse, Kalis said, his four eyes filled with a profound sadness. He has taken the human capacity for instinct and turned it into a component for a machine. We have to get them out, Lyra said, her voice regaining its strength. She moved to the central console, her fingers blurring across the keys. I can initiate an emergency purge of the fluid. It'll wake them up, but they'll be weak. Do it, I said. I'll find the comm link and... I'm afraid that won't be possible, Deputy Minister. A cold, synthesized voice echoed through the chamber. We spun around. Standing on a balcony above the processing bay was Commander Valthor. Beside him were 6 Vanguard troopers, their rifles leveled at us. Valthor looked down at the tanks with a detached, clinical interest. You look distressed, Cyrus. I would have thought a man of your experience would understand the necessity of sacrifice. Efficiency is the only law that matters on Obsidian 3. Without the output from these subjects, our defense grid would fail within 48 hours. The Xylos people would be defenseless against the raiders from the Outer Rim. Defense isn't an excuse for murder, Valthor, I shouted, my pistol aimed at his head. Murder is such a biological term, Valthor countered, his red optic glowing with a predatory light. I prefer to think of it as optimization. And now you have something I need. The data shard you stole contains the master keys for the entire processing network. With it, I can increase the output by 300%. You're never getting it, Lyra said, clutching the shard to her chest. Then you are of no further use to the state, Valthor said. He made a slight gesture with his metal hand. Kill the human, secure the Arbiter, and bring me the girl. The chamber erupted into chaos. The Vanguard troopers opened fire, blue plasma bolts shattering the glass tanks and sending waves of amber fluid cascading across the floor. I dove behind a metal crate, pulling Kalis with me, as the humans inside the broken tanks spilled out like discarded dolls, gasping for air in a world that had forgotten them. Lyra, get down! I yelled, but she was already moving, dodging between the rows of cylinders with a grace I hadn't expected from a diplomat. This was the turning point. This was where the cost of my silence became a debt I couldn't pay. I looked at the dying people on the floor, their eyes fluttering with the confusion of a nightmare that wouldn't end. I wasn't a bartender anymore. I was a soldier of the Recon Corps, and I had a mission. Kalis, I said, looking the old alien in the eyes. Can you override the security on the balcony? I can try, he said, his 4 hands reaching out to tap into a nearby data conduit. But it will take everything I have left. Do it, I said, checking my pistol one last time. I'm going up. The air in the processing bay was a thick mist of vaporized fluid and ozone. I moved through the carnage with a grim, focused intensity, my boots splashing through the amber liquid that now coated the floor. Every few steps I had to sidestep a coughing, shivering human who had just been forcefully returned to reality. Their faces were masks of terror, their eyes wide and unseeing. I wanted to stop, to tell them they were safe, but the blue bolts of plasma overhead reminded me that safety was currently a very expensive luxury. Sarge! I hissed into my comlink, hoping the droid could hear me through the facility's interference. I need a distraction. Can you tap into the ventilation system? Give these bucketheads something to chew on. A static-filled crackle answered me. Vane, you... crazy, son of a... I'm on it. Triggering. Thermal. Vent. Now. A second later, a series of high-pressure pipes along the ceiling hissed and roared. Thick white steam erupted in a blinding curtain, obscuring the balcony where Valthor was standing. The Vanguard troopers hesitated, their sensors struggling to compensate for the sudden thermal bloom. That was my opening. I didn't take the stairs. I climbed a stack of shipping crates and leaped for a hanging catwalk. My fingers caught the cold metal, the jolt sending a spear of pain through my bruised ribs. But I didn't let go. I hauled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, and rolled onto the walkway. I was 10 meters from Balthor. "Trooper, 10 o'clock!" "Huwag," one of the vanguards shouted, his visor turning toward me. I fired my pulse pistol. The bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but his armor absorbed most of the impact. I didn't stop to see if he stayed down. I was a blur of movement, closing the distance between me and the commander. Balthor didn't move. He stood there, his red optic tracking my movement with a terrifying calm. As I leaped over a railing to land on the balcony, he simply raised a hand. A hidden kinetic pulse generator in his palm flared, and I was hit by a wall of force that felt like a charging rhino. I was thrown backward, my breath leaving my body in a sudden, violent rush. I hit a wall and slid to the floor, my pistol clattering away into the darkness below. "Your species is so predictably aggressive, Cyrus," Balthor said, walking toward me with a rhythmic, mechanical clank. "You believe that one man with a sense of righteous indignation can overturn a system that has been refined over centuries. It is an illogical delusion." I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead. I looked down into the bay. Kalis was still slumped over the data conduit, his skin glowing with a faint, pulsing indigo light. He was fighting a digital war I couldn't even see. Below him, Lyra was trying to shield a group of survivors from the stray fire of the remaining troopers. "It's not a delusion, Balthor," I gasped, spitting out a mouthful of blood. "It's called being alive, something you forgot about a long time ago." Balthor stood over me, his shadow looming large against the white steam. He reached down and gripped my throat with his metal hand. The pressure was immense, the cold alloy digging into my skin. I clawed at his wrist, but it was like trying to break a steel beam with my bare fingers. "Life is an equation," Balthor whispered, his voice a grating hum. "I have calculated the value of your species. You are a high-energy fuel source with a short shelf life. Nothing more. Now tell me where the girl hid the backup codes, or I will begin processing the survivors right in front of your eyes." I looked past him. Kalis had looked up. Our eyes met across the chamber. The old Arbiter didn't look frail anymore. He looked like a god of the old world, his 4 eyes burning with a terrifying celestial light. "Cyrus!" Kalis's voice didn't come from his throat. It echoed in my mind, a thunderous roar of pure energy. "The bypass is ready. Drop." I didn't think. I kicked Balthor in his mechanical knee with every ounce of strength I had left. He didn't budge, but the surprise made his grip loosen for a fraction of a second. I twisted out of his hand and rolled over the edge of the balcony. As I fell, the entire facility screamed. Kalis had initiated a system-wide feedback loop. Every cable, every console, and every tank erupted in a cascade of indigo lightning. The Vanguard troopers were thrown back as their armor's electronics surged and melted. Balthor roared in a synthesized voice as his own internal systems fought to contain the overload. I hit the floor of the processing bay, the amber fluid cushioning my fall just enough to keep me from breaking my back. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. "Lyra! Kalis!" I shouted. Lyra was already running toward me, helping a human woman stand. "The backup exit. Father found a service tunnel that leads to the geothermal vents." I looked toward Kalis. He was still at the conduit, his hands fused to the metal by the sheer intensity of the energy he was channeling. His indigo skin was turning a dull burnt gray. "Kalis, let go!" I yelled, running toward him. "We have to move." "Go," he whispered, his eyes dimming. "The surge. It will hold the Vanguard for 5 minutes. I must stay to ensure the purge is complete. The soul, they must be free, Cyrus." "I'm not leaving you." I reached for his hands, but a bolt of indigo energy threw me back. "You are a soldier, Cyrus Vane," Kalis said, his voice now a soft, melodic hum that sounded like a lullaby. "And a soldier knows when the bridge must be burned. Save my daughter. Save your people. That is the only order that matters." The ceiling began to groan. The feedback loop was destabilizing the facility's primary reactors. Huge chunks of concrete began to fall from the heights, crushing the empty tanks. "Father, please!" Lyra cried, her voice breaking. Kalis looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the stern High Arbiter was replaced by a father's love. He blinked all four eyes in a slow Xylos goodbye. Then he closed them. A massive explosion rocked the facility. The balcony where Valthor had been standing collapsed in a tangle of girders and fire. "Cyrus, we have to go now." Lyra grabbed my arm, her strength surprising me. "The whole sector's going to blow." I looked at Kalis one last time. He was a statue of gray ash, still holding the conduit that had freed 1,000 souls. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a cold weight that I knew would never leave me. He had chosen to be the bridge. "Move!" I barked, grabbing a young man who was staring at the fire in shock. "To the tunnel! Hustle, people, if you want to keep your skin." We fled into the dark. We were a ragtag group of 30 humans and one Xylos diplomat, running through a maze of steam and fire. Behind us, the facility that had been a factory of despair was becoming a pyre. We reached the service tunnel just as the primary reactor went critical. The shockwave threw us forward, a wall of heat and sound that felt like the end of the world. We scrambled through the dark, the air thick with dust, until we saw a glimmer of green light ahead. We tumbled out onto the obsidian glass of the low-light sector. I stood up and looked back. A column of fire was rising from the cliffside, piercing the dark clouds like a red needle. The intake facility was gone. I looked at the people around me. They were shivering, huddled together for warmth, their eyes reflecting the distant fire. They were broken, traumatized, and half-starved, but they were breathing. Lyra stood beside me, her face streaked with soot and tears. She held the data shard in her hand, the evidence that would bring down Valthor, but her eyes were fixed on the fire where her father had stayed. "He didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, he did," I said, my voice heavy with a new kind of certainty. "He understood something we're still trying to learn, Lyra." "What's that?" "That a law is just words on a screen," I said, looking at my hands. They were covered in grease, blood, and the indigo ash of a man who had been my friend. But a life is the only thing that actually has a price. I looked at the survivors. They were looking at me, waiting for an order, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a cog in someone else's machine. I felt like a man who had finally found his own sitrep. "Listen up," I shouted, my voice carrying over the wind. "We've got a long walk ahead of us. We're heading for the scrap yards. Sarge 5 is waiting, and we've got a war to win." We started to walk, a line of shadows moving across a world of glass. The turning point was behind us. We had lost a legend, but we had gained a purpose. Valthor was still out there, and the spire was still standing. But the secret was out. The souls were free. And as I walked beside Lyra, I realized that the line between right and wrong wasn't thin at all. It was as wide as the galaxy and as bright as the stars we were going to reach. We had 30 kilometers to cover before dawn, 30 kilometers of obsidian glass and Vanguard patrols. But I wasn't worried. I had a debt to pay to an old man who liked Earth soup, and I wasn't going to stop until the check was settled. "Check your 6, I told Lyra, offering her a hand over a jagged ridge. "The night is long, but we're the only ones who know how to walk in it." She took my hand, her grip firm. "Then let's move, Cyrus. We have a world to wake up." We disappeared into the dark, 31 souls against a planet of machines. And for the first time in my life, I liked the odds. The trek through the low-light sector was a descent into a specific kind of purgatory. Obsidian 3 did not offer the mercy of a flat horizon. Instead, it presented a jagged obsidian teethscape that chewed through boot leather and morale with equal appetite. We were a column of ghosts, 31 of us, stretching across the frozen volcanic glass like a line of spilled ink. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of our footsteps and the whistling of the wind as it whipped through the razor-edged ravines, carrying the distant, metallic screams of the planet's shifting crust. I walked at the head of the line, my eyes fixed on the path ahead but my mind lingering on the fire back at the intake facility. Kalis was gone. The realization felt like a lead weight in my chest, a physical pressure that made every breath a struggle. He had been more than a customer or a source of information. He had been the first person in 5 years to look at me and see a man instead of a broken tool, and I had let him stay. "Cyrus," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She was walking beside me, her silver robes now a patchwork of soot and grime. She held the data shard as if it were a holy relic, her fingers white-knuckled around its glowing edges. "The survivors, they won't make it another 10 kilometers. They're civilian-grade, malnourished, and their lung filters are failing." I looked back. The group was flagging. A middle-aged man I remembered as a dock worker was leaning heavily on a younger woman, his breathing a wet, ragged sound that echoed off the glass walls. Two others were stumbling, their eyes glazed with the onset of hypothermia. The cold on the dark side of this rock didn't just chill you, it hunted you, looking for any gap in your thermal insulation to leach the life out of your marrow. "They have to make it," I said, my voice like iron. "There's no plan B out here, Lyra. It's either the scrap yards or the morgue. We stop now. The cold finishes what Valthor started." "You're talking like a soldier again," she countered, a flash of her father's fire in her violet eyes. "These aren't recon troopers. They're people. They need a reason to keep moving besides your fear of a vanguard patrol." "Fear has kept me alive longer than hope ever did," I grunted, but I stopped the line. We were in a narrow gully, shielded slightly from the biting wind. "Fine. 5 minutes. We huddle together for thermal sharing. Check your filters. If you've got any stim tabs left, now's the time to use them." The survivors collapsed where they stood, drawing into a tight circle. I watched them, the familiar itch of leadership scratching at the back of my brain. In the Recon Corps, I had led men into the jaws of hell, and I had always known the sitrep. But these people didn't need a commander. They needed a miracle. I moved to the edge of the gully, scanning our six with a pair of thermal goggles I'd scavenged from a fallen guard. The horizon was a mess of shifting grays and blacks, but then I saw it, a single pinpoint of blue light hovering 2 kilometers back. It was moving with a smooth, predatory grace that suggested a high-end flight stabilizer. "Hunter-killer," I hissed. Lyra was at my side in a heartbeat. "A drone?" "The best Valthor has. A Wraith-class seeker. It's tuned to human biosigns and high-energy data signatures. It's ghosting us, waiting for the signal to paint our position for the orbital strikes." "We can't outrun it," Lyra realized, her voice trembling. "No, we can't, but we can outthink it." I turned to the group, my mind racing through tactical maneuvers I hadn't used in a decade. "Listen up. We've got a buckethead drone on our tail. It's looking for a cluster of 31 heat signatures. If we stay together, we're a target for a plasma rain. We need to split up." A murmur of terror rippled through the group. The woman I'd helped earlier stepped forward, her eyes wide. "Split up? In the dark? We'll be lost in minutes." "Not if you follow the beacons," I said, pulling 3 small emergency flares from my belt. "Lyra, you take 10 people. Head east through the glass throat. Use the low-profile vents. I'll take the other 20 and double back through the ravines. We'll meet at the Solaris 9 in 3 hours. "And the drone?" Lyra asked. "I'm going to give it something better to hunt," I said, pulling the data shard from her hand. "Cyrus, no. That shard is the only way to stop Valthor. I'm not going to lose it. I'm going to use it as bait. It's leaking a high-frequency energy signal. If I crank up the output on my stealth shroud to create a resonance, that Wraith will think I'm the whole damn group." I looked her in the eyes, the weight of Kalis' sacrifice pushing me forward. "I'm a soldier, Lyra. I know how to disappear. You get these people to Sarge. That's your order." She stared at me, and for a second I thought she was going to argue. Then she nodded, her violet eyes shining with a mixture of respect and grief. "Stay frosty, Cyrus. Don't let that thing get a lock on you." "I've been dodged by better machines than this," I lied, forcing a grin. "Now move. Time to bug out." As the two groups vanished into the shadows, I stood alone in the gully. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to mock my bravado. I took the data shard and shoved it into the external port of my jacket. Then I hit the override on my shroud. The device hummed, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in my teeth. On a thermal scanner, I now looked like a sun going supernova. "Come and get it, you scrap heap," I muttered. I began to run, not away from the drone but parallel to it, leading it into the heart of the jagged obsidian fields. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat. Every breath was a lungful of needles, the cold air burning my throat. I leaped over a 3-meter crevice, my boots skidding on the glass, and tumbled into a ravine. The blue light of the Wraith drone grew brighter, the hum of its engines now a physical thrum in the air. It was closing the gap. I could see its sensor array now, a spinning cluster of red eyes that searched the dark for the source of the anomaly. I dove behind a massive pillar of obsidian, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was 100 meters from a vertical drop, the Sunder Pit. It was a 500-meter plunge into a geothermal vent. If I could lure the drone over the edge, the thermal turbulence would scramble its flight logic. The drone rounded the corner, its red eyes locking onto me. A burst of twin-linked plasma fire erupted from its underbelly, vaporizing the pillar of glass above my head in a shower of white-hot sparks. "Missed me by a mile," I yelled, though the heat had singed the hair on my arms. I scrambled out of the cover and sprinted for the edge of the pit. The drone followed, its engines screaming as it accelerated. I could feel the heat of its weapons charge building up again. 20 meters. 10. At the very edge of the abyss, I skidded to a halt and threw the data shard, actually a decoy capacitor I'd rigged with a glowing stim tab, into the pit. At the same moment, I hit the kill switch on my shroud, plunging myself into absolute thermal darkness. The Wraith drone didn't hesitate. Its logic gates saw the high-energy signature falling into the pit and calculated a priority 1 recovery. It dove after the light, its thrusters flaring as it disappeared into the rising steam of the geothermal vent. A second later, a muffled explosion echoed from the depths. A pillar of blue flame erupted from the pit, lighting up the sky for a heartbeat before vanishing. The drone was gone. I slumped onto the cold glass, my body shaking with a sudden, violent release of adrenaline. I was alone in the dark, 5 kilometers from the scrapyards with a dying battery and a data shard that was the only hope for 100,000 people. I reached into my pocket and felt the real data shard. It was cool to the touch, its light dimming as if it were exhausted. "We're still here, Kalis," I whispered into the void. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I didn't have a map, and I didn't have a beacon, but I had a purpose. I looked toward the distant hazy glow of the scrapyards on the horizon and began to walk. The humanistic theme wasn't a subtext anymore. It was a physical weight. Every step I took was a choice to keep moving, to keep fighting, not because I was ordered to, but because I refused to let the darkness win. I realized then that Valthor's logic was flawed. He thought that by taking our lives, he could steal our strength. But he didn't understand that our strength didn't come from our neural nets or our output. It came from our ability to suffer, to grieve, and to keep walking anyway. By the time I saw the hulking silhouette of the Solaris 9, the first hints of a pale, sickly dawn were bleeding into the sky. I was a walking corpse, my skin blue with cold and my clothes shredded by the glass. But as I approached the airlock, the door hissed open, and I saw Sarge 5 standing there, his amber eye glowing like a sun. "Vane," the droid boomed, his voice a balm to my frayed nerves. "You're late. I was about to start a betting pool on whether you'd end up as a popsicle or a plasma stain." "Save your credits, Sarge," I rasped, stumbling into the warmth of the ship. "The sitrep is green. For now." Lyra ran toward me, her face a mask of relief. She caught me as I fell, her arms strong and warm. "You did it, Cyrus. They're all here. Every one of them." I pulled the data shard from my pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Get it to the transmitter, Lyra. Tell the galaxy what's happening here. Tell them we're not fuel." As the world began to fade into a gray blur of exhaustion, I saw the survivors watching me. They weren't looking at a bartender or a soldier. They were looking at a man who had chosen them over himself. And in their eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. But in the dark side of Obsidian 3, it was the only light we had. The interior of the Solaris 9 was a hive of frantic activity. Sarge 5 had converted the main cargo bay into a makeshift infirmary and command center. The 30 survivors were huddled on sleeping mats, wrapped in thermal blankets, while small repair droids scuttled between them, dispensing nutrient-rich broths and patching up wounds. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and medicinal salve, a gritty reminder of the cost of our escape. "Listen up, you meat sacks," Sarge Five's voice echoed through the bay, his optical sensor pulsing with a frantic amber light. Valthor isn't just sitting on his thumbs. My long-range scanners are picking up a mass deployment from the Spire. He's launched the purification satellites. In 6 hours, they'll be in position to broadcast the high-frequency override signal across the entire planet. Every human on Obsidian 3 will have their neural link hijacked. They'll be walking into the processing tanks of their own accord. I stood by the central tactical map, my head throbbing. I'd had 2 hours of sleep and a stim shot that made my hands twitch, but the transformation Kalis had started was complete. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning a revolution. "How do we stop the signal?" I asked, my voice tight. "The satellites are controlled by the primary transmitter at the apex of the spire," Sarge 5 explained, a holographic needle of the tower appearing above the table. "If we can knock out the transmitter before the broadcast begins, the satellites will drift into the atmosphere and burn up. But Valthor has installed a localized shield grid. A direct orbital strike from a friendly ship, if we even had one, wouldn't scratch it. We have to do it from the inside," Lyra said. She was standing beside me, her robes replaced by a suit of black tactical gear she'd scavenged from Sarge's armory. She looked like her father now, poised, dangerous, and ready for a reckoning. "I still have my administrative override for the transmitter's manual maintenance port, but we need to get to the top floor." "The top floor is Valthor's private sanctum," I said. "It's a 0 dark 30 run with a 99% chance of failure." "Then we better make that 1% count," a voice spoke up from the shadows of the bay. I turned to see a man I hadn't noticed before, Jackson. He was an old contact of mine from the street slum days, a scavenger who dealt in illegal tech and secrets. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between me and the droid. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" "I saw the fire at the intake facility, Cyrus," he said, stepping into the light. He looked haggard, his skin sallow and his clothes tattered. "I knew you'd be heading for Sarge. I've got info. Valthor, he's not just using humans. He's purged his own council. Anyone who wasn't optimized is being hunted. The city is a war zone." "We're moving on the spire, Jackson," I said, studying his face. Something was off. He was too twitchy, even for a scav rat. "We could use your knowledge of the service tunnels." Jackson hesitated, his hand reaching for a small communication device in his pocket. "Cyrus, I don't know if this is a good idea. Valthor is offering a full pardon and 10,000 credits for the data shard. That's enough to get off this rock forever. We could take a shuttle, leave the diplomat and the droid behind, and never look back." The room went silent. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I forced it down. This was the test. This was the thin line between being a man who follows orders and a man who makes choices. 10,000 credits is a lot of money, Jackson," I said quietly, walking toward him. "But how many lives is it worth? 30? 30,000? "They're just cogs, Cyrus." Jackson shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "The galaxy doesn't care about us. We're the dust. Why are you risking everything for a species that would turn its back on you in a heartbeat?" I stopped inches from his face. I could see the reflection of my own tired eyes in his pupils. "Because I'm tired of being dust, Jackson, and because an old man who had every reason to hate me died so I could have a choice. I'm not selling that choice for 10,000 credits." Jackson's hand tightened on the communicator. He went to trigger it, his eyes filled with a terrified greed. Before he could press the button, I grabbed his wrist in a grip that made the bones groan. I didn't pull my pistol. I didn't hit him. I just looked at him, letting the weight of my transformation settle over him. "Don't do it, Jackson. Not because I'll kill you, but because if you do, you'll never be able to look at yourself in a mirror again. You'll just be another machine in Valthor's empire." Jackson stared at me, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For a long, agonizing minute, the fate of our mission hung by a thread. Then his hand went limp. He dropped the communicator onto the floor and slumped against a crate, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry, Cyrus," he whispered. I'm so damn tired of being afraid." We all are, I said, patting him on the shoulder. But fear is a bad navigator. Sarge, get him some water and a stim patch. We need him focused. I turned back to the map. The betrayal had been averted, but the cost was rising. I could feel the clock ticking. Every minute we spent here was a minute closer to the purification launch. Sarge, what's the sit rep on the ground forces? Bad news, boss, the droid replied, his amber eye dimming. Valthor has moved a battalion of Vanguard to the base of the spire. They've set up a perimeter of automated turrets and sonic mines. A frontal assault is suicide. Then we don't go through the front, I said, pointing to the very top of the spire on the hologram. Lyra, you said there's a diplomatic shuttle bay on level 96. Is it still active? It's on a separate power grid, she said, but it's heavily guarded. I've got an idea, I said, looking at Sarge 5. Sarge, how's that primary cooling loop you wanted me to fix? Leaking like a sieve? Why? Because if we overload it, it'll create a massive steam eruption at the base of the spire. It won't do much damage, but it'll create a thermal blind spot that'll last for 15 minutes. If we time it right, we can fly a modified scav shuttle right through the sensor net and land directly on the shuttle bay. Sarge 5 let out a sound like grinding gears. You want to fly a pile of junk through a geothermal explosion into the most heavily guarded building in the sector? Vane, your tactical logic is officially FUBAR. It's the only way, Sarge, I said. I'll fly. Lyra, you're on the system's override. Sarge, you stay here and coordinate the broadcast once we hit the transmitter. If we fail, you launch the data shard into the deep space relay. At least the galaxy will know the truth. I don't like it, Sarge 5 muttered, his optical sensor flickering. But I suppose someone has to keep you meat sacks from making a total mess of things. We spent the next 3 hours prepping the scav shuttle, a battered twin-engine tug that looked like it belonged in a museum of industrial accidents. We reinforced the hull with plates of scrap obsidian and rigged the engines to run on a high-octane mix of synthetic fuel and ozone. It was a death trap, but it was our death trap. As we prepared to launch, I walked through the cargo bay one last time. The survivors were watching us, their faces illuminated by the dim light of the ship. They didn't say anything, but the silence was more powerful than any speech. They were the reason we were doing this. They were the proof that humanity wasn't just a biological classification, it was a commitment. I stopped in front of the little girl with the scrap metal doll. She reached out and touched my hand, her fingers cold but steady. Are you going to bring the stars back? She asked. I knelt down, looking into her wide, innocent eyes. I'm going to try, kid. I'm going to try real hard. I stood up and walked toward the shuttle where Lyra was waiting. She looked at me, her violet eyes reflecting the red glow of the emergency lights. My father would have been proud of you, Cyrus, she said. I'm just finishing the meal he started, I replied, stepping into the cockpit. I gripped the flight sticks, the familiar weight of the controls grounding me. I checked the sensors. The purification countdown was at 1 hour and 45 minutes. Sarge, trigger the cooling loop on my mark, I said into the comms. 3, 2, 1, mark. A massive explosion rocked the bedrock of Obsidian 3. A pillar of white steam, 300 meters high, erupted from the base of the spire, obscuring the tower in a blinding thermal shroud. Let's go, I roared, slamming the throttles forward. The scav shuttle screamed as it tore through the air, heading straight for the heart of the storm. We were flying blind, guided only by gut instinct and the desperate hope of 1,000 souls. The spire loomed ahead, a black needle piercing the white mist. We were seconds away from impact or infiltration. I didn't know which one it would be. But as I pushed the engines to their breaking point, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to die. I was only afraid of not having lived enough to make a difference. We hit the thermal wall, and the world turned white. Hold on, Lyra, I yelled over the roar of the engines. We're going in. The thin line between right and wrong was gone. There was only the mission, the girl, and the stars waiting on the other side. And as the scav shuttle punched through the sensor net, I knew that whatever happened next, the story of Cyrus Vane was no longer a tragedy. It was a beginning. The impact was less of a landing and more of a high-velocity disagreement between our scav shuttle and the reinforced obsidian deck of level 96. The white steam from Sarge 5's diversion had blinded the automated turrets for those crucial 4 seconds, but the landing struts had sheared off the moment we touched down. We skidded across the bay, a jagged trail of sparks and screaming metal, marking our progress toward the primary docking hangar. I hauled back on the emergency thrusters, the deceleration slamming me into the harness, with enough force to make my vision swim in a sea of red and black. We came to a shuddering halt 10 meters from the edge of the shuttle bay's precipice. Outside, the swirling dark clouds of Obsidian 3's upper atmosphere clawed at the viewport. "Sit rep!" I barked, coughing as the cabin filled with the acrid stench of burnt wiring and spent fire suppressant. "Systems are foobar," Lyra gasped, her hands shaking as she unbuckled her restraints. She had a nasty cut across her cheek, the violet xylose blood shimmering like liquid amethyst in the flickering emergency lights. "But we're inside the perimeter. The transmitter hub is only 2 levels above us." "Check your 6, I said, kicking the manual release on the hatch. The door groaned and fell away, revealing a hangar swarming with Vanguard troopers. They weren't prepared for a suicide run by a hunk of scrap metal, but they were professionals. Within seconds, the first volley of blue plasma bolts was splashing against the shuttle's hull. "Take cover!" I hauled Lyra out of the ship, sliding behind a heavy-duty cargo container. I drew my pulse pistol, checking the readout. 30%. "We can't stay pinned down here. Sarge, do you read?" "Loud and clear, you magnificent idiot," the droid's voice crackled through my headset. "The steam's clearing. Valthor is rerouting power to the atmospheric cannons. If you don't hit that transmitter in the next 15 minutes, this whole sector is going to be a smoking crater." "Understood. Lyra, the maintenance lift. Can you override the lock?" She looked at the panel across the hangar, guarded by 4 troopers in heavy-duty riot armor. "I can, but I need a clear line for 3 seconds to hack the frequency." "I'll give you 5, I said. I didn't wait for her response. I stood up and laid down a suppressing fire, the blue bolts of my pistol peppering the troopers' positions. I moved like a ghost, a technique from my recon days that I thought I'd forgotten. Short bursts of speed, low profile, never staying in the same spot for more than a heartbeat. "Go! Go now!" I yelled. Lyra sprinted across the open floor, her silver and black suit a blur. She hit the terminal and her fingers danced across the holographic interface. One trooper stepped out from cover, his rifle leveled at her back. I didn't think. I threw my empty pistol at his head and lunged. I tackled him, my shoulder connecting with his chest plate with a dull thud. We went down in a heap of metal and meat. I didn't use a gun. I used my hands, my elbows, the raw, unrefined fury of a man who had seen too many people turned into batteries. "Lift's open!" Lyra screamed. I rolled off the trooper, grabbing his dropped carbine, and sprinted for the elevator. We scrambled inside just as a grenade detonated where we had been standing a second ago. The doors hissed shut, and the lift began its rapid ascent toward the apex of the spire. The silence inside the elevator was deafening. I leaned against the back wall, my chest heaving, the borrowed carbine heavy in my hands. I looked at Lyra. She was staring at her hands, which were covered in grease and xylose blood. "Is this what it's like?" she asked, her voice small. "To be a soldier? To live in the space between heartbeats?" "It's not living, Lyra," I said, looking at the floor indicators. "It's just surviving. There's a difference. My father once told me that the greatest tragedy of the Xylos was that we forgot how to feel the dirt beneath our feet," she whispered. "Valthor didn't just replace his heart with a machine. He replaced his purpose with an algorithm. We're about to reboot that algorithm," I replied. The lift chimed as it reached level 98. The doors slid open to reveal the sanctum of the High Arbiter. It was a circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a 360-degree view of the planet's dark side. In the center stood the primary transmitter, a towering pillar of white light and humming data cores. And standing in front of it was Commander Valthor. He wasn't wearing his helmet. His face was a patchwork of pale synthetic skin and chrome plating, his single red optic glowing with a steady, terrifying light. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Cyrus Vane," Valthor said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You have traveled thousands of kilometers, sacrificed a legend, and destroyed a billion-credit facility. For what? To delay the inevitable? The purification is the only way to ensure the survival of this colony. Without it, the resource depletion will lead to a total systemic collapse within 10 years. People aren't resources, Valthor, I said, raising the carbine. They aren't numbers on your balance sheet. They are components of a larger organism, the commander countered, stepping toward us. A single human life is a fleeting, chaotic variable. But 1,000 human minds, synchronized and optimized, provide the processing power to solve the energy crisis. It is a simple equation of utility. My father died because he believed that equation was a lie, Lyra said, stepping forward beside me. She held the data shard aloft. He believed that a society that harvests its own people has already collapsed. You're not saving Obsidian 3, Valthor. You're just turning it into a very efficient grave. Valthor's mechanical hand twitched. Give me the shard, Lyra. Do not force me to terminate the last of the Zun line. Try it, Buckethead, I growled. Valthor moved with the speed of a combat link. He lunged, a hidden blade extending from his wrist. I met him halfway, the borrowed carbine acting as a parrying bar. The sound of metal on metal was like a thunderclap. I was strong, but Valthor was a machine. He threw me across the room like I was a rag doll. Lyra dove for the transmitter console, her fingers frantic as she initiated the override sequence. Valthor turned toward her, his red eye locking onto her position. Illegal access detected. Security protocol Alpha 1 initiated. He raised his arm, a built-in pulse cannon charging with a high-pitched whine. I scrambled to my feet, my ribs screaming in agony. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. I just had the image of Kalis Sun standing at the conduit, turning into ash to save a group of strangers. I lunged at Valthor's legs, tackling his mechanical knees. He stumbled, the pulse shot going wide and shattering a window. The sudden decompression sucked the air out of the room, a violent wind screaming as the atmosphere tried to equalize. "The shard!" I yelled over the roar of the wind. "Lyra, use the shard!" Valthor kicked me in the chest, the impact cracking my sternum. I fell back, gasping for air that wasn't there. He stood over me, his blade poised above my throat. "You are a fascinating specimen, Vane. Your irrationality is almost admirable, but it is still a defect." "It's not a defect," I wheezed, looking him dead in the eye. "It's the only thing you couldn't calculate." Lyra slammed the data shard into the transmitter's primary port. A wave of indigo light erupted from the pillar, the same energy Kalis had channeled in his final moments. It wasn't a destructive force. It was a carrier wave. It carried the voices, the memories, and the names of every human Valthor had processed. The spire shook. The transmitter didn't blow up. It sang. 1 billion gigabytes of human emotion flooded the network. Valthor froze. His red optic began to flicker. His mechanical limbs jerked with a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. He wasn't being hacked. He was being overwhelmed. The optimization he had sought was being drowned in the raw, messy complexity of human suffering and hope. "Error," his voice box sparked. "Logic loop detected. Empathy. Variance. Unresolvable. Why? Why do they mourn?" "Because that's what we do," I said, standing up and grabbing the carbine from the floor. "We mourn, we hurt, and we remember." I didn't fire the weapon. I didn't need to. The feedback loop from the transmitter was tearing Valthor's neural link apart. He collapsed to his knees, his synthetic skin bubbling as his internal processors began to melt. "Cyrus, it's working!" Lyra shouted, holding on to the console to keep from being sucked out the broken window. "The satellites are losing synchronization. The broadcast is dead." Valthor looked up at me one last time. For a brief second, the red light in his eye turned a pale, natural gray. "I calculated everything," he whispered, his voice losing its mechanical edge. "But I forgot to account for the soup." Then the light went out. Commander Valthor slumped forward, a hollow shell of polymer and steel. The humming of the spire began to fade, replaced by the natural howl of the wind outside. The purification was over. I stumbled over to Lyra and pulled her away from the broken window. We collapsed together on the floor, the indigo light of the transmitter fading into a soft, gentle glow. Is it over? She asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, I said, looking out at the horizon. For the first time in 5 years, the clouds over Obsidian 3 seemed to be thinning. It's over. We sat there in the silence of the sanctum, two survivors in a world that had almost forgotten what it meant to be alive. I felt the weight of every choice I'd made, from the first bowl of soup to the final tackle. I had spent my life running from the ghosts of the Helios Gate, only to find that the only way to silence them was to listen to what they were trying to tell me. They weren't telling me to be a hero. They were just telling me to be a man. The weeks following the fall of the Spire felt like the slow, agonizing thaw of a world that had been frozen for a century. The Iron Hand didn't collapse overnight, but without Valthor's central logic and the purification data, the organization fractured into squabbling factions. The Planetary Council, spurred by the evidence Lyra and I had broadcast to the galaxy, was forced to dismantle the non-prime legislation. Obsidian 3 was still a hard, industrial rock, but for the first time, the people living in its shadows were breathing air that didn't smell like fear. I stood in the center of the rusty anchor, or what was left of it. The Reconstruction Committee had offered me a prime location in the Upper District, a place with real windows and a marble bar, but I'd turned them down. I wanted my tavern back. I wanted the cracked oak, the smell of alien spices, and the history that lived in the floorboards. I was currently hammering a new piece of weathered wood into the front door frame. My ribs still ached when I moved too fast, and I had a permanent scar running across my temple, but my hands were steady. "You're doing it wrong, Vane," a booming voice echoed from the street. I looked up to see Sarge 5 rolling toward me. He was sporting a new polished chrome chest plate and a set of high-end optical sensors. Behind him followed a group of human volunteers from the scrap yards carrying crates of supplies. "I'm doing it the human way, Sarge," I grunted, wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. "It's supposed to look a little crooked. Gives it character." "It gives it a structural integrity rating of 0, the droid countered, but he gestured for the volunteers to start unloading. "I brought the Earth Standard fermentation tanks you requested, and the coffee. Real beans this time, not that synthetic sawdust you used to serve." "Thanks, Sarge. How are the others?" "The survivors from the intake facility are being settled into the New Harmony District," Sarge 5 said, his amber eye glowing softly. "The little girl with the doll, she's the one who insisted we bring you these." He handed me a small hand-painted sign. It said, "The Anchor," in shaky, colorful letters. I felt a lump in my throat that no amount of synthetic rye could wash away. I took the sign and hung it by the door. "Tell her I'll have a seat waiting for her when we open." A sleek white transport pulled up to the curb. It didn't have the menacing look of a Vanguard vehicle. It was a diplomatic courier. The hatch opened and Lyra Zun stepped out. She wasn't wearing her silver robes or her tactical gear. She was in a simple dark tunic, her lavender skin glowing in the pale light of the planet's morning. "Cyrus," she said, her voice warm. "Deputy Minister," I replied, offering a half-smile. "I heard the Council appointed you as the High Overseer of Interspecies Relations." "It's a fancy title for a job that involves a lot of arguing," she said, walking over to the bar. She ran a hand over the newly polished wood. "But it's a start. We're establishing the Kalis Zun Foundation for Refugee Integration. The first branch will be right here in the lower district." "He would have liked that," I said. "He would have hated the paperwork." She laughed, then her expression turned serious. "The Earth ship arrived this morning, Cyrus. The Venture 3. They're looking for you. They've heard the story of the human who stood his ground. They want to offer you a position in the new embassy. A chance to go home." I looked around the tavern. I saw the dents in the wall from the Vanguard raid. I saw the spot where Kalis used to sit and eat his soup. I saw the people outside, humans and Xylos working together to clear the obsidian dust from the gutters. "I am home, Lyra," I said. I walked behind the bar and poured 2 glasses of water, clear, fresh water from the newly restored deep core wells. I pushed one toward her. "Obsidian 3 needs a bridge," I said. "And I've realized that a bridge isn't just something you walk over. It's something you maintain, one day at a time, one person at a time." She took the glass, her violet eyes meeting mine. "To the bridge, then." "To the bridge," I echoed. Later that evening, after the workers had gone and the tavern was quiet, I sat on the porch and watched the 3 moons of Obsidian 3 rise. The air was cold, but for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide from it. I thought about the journey from a bitter ex-soldier to a man who had risked everything for a bowl of soup. I had spent 34 years believing that the world was a machine, and I was just a cog that had been discarded. I thought that my mistakes at the Helios Gate defined me, that I was a man of shadows. But in the silence of the dark side, I had learned that the shadows are only there because there's a light burning somewhere else. I think back on that first night when Kaylee Zune sat in the cold, shivering like a ghost. I remember the weight of the bowl in my hands and the way I almost walked back inside and ignored him. It would have been the logical choice. It would have been the efficient choice. Valthor would have approved. But if I had made that choice, I would have died long before the spire fell. I would have died the moment I decided that my comfort was worth more than his life. We spend so much of our lives trying to calculate the cost of our actions. We ask if it's worth it, if it's safe, if it's right according to the laws of men or machines. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. The only thing that actually matters is what we do when no one is looking and there's nothing to gain. Compassion isn't a strategy, it's a surrender. It's a surrender to the fact that we are all connected by the same fragile, beautiful thread of existence. I used to think I was the only human on this planet. Now I realize that humanity isn't about what species you are. It's about the choice to see yourself in the eyes of another, especially when those eyes have 4 pupils and are clouded with cataracts. I'm just a tavern keeper now. I don't have a uniform, and I don't have a mission briefing. But every morning, I wake up and I check the sit rep. I check the soup. I check the door. And I make sure that anyone who comes in, whether they have 2 arms or 4, whether they're made of flesh or chrome, knows that they're not just a number, they're a guest. And in this corner of the galaxy, that's the most revolutionary thing you can be. I often sit here and wonder about the choices we make. I spent years carrying that anger like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I wonder, is there someone in your life you have been holding on to resentment against? Or perhaps there is a small, quiet act of kindness you've been hesitating to perform because it doesn't seem efficient? What would happen if you stopped calculating the cost and just fed the ghost? The moons reached their zenith, casting a pale silver light over the city. I stood up, stretched my aching limbs, and walked back inside the anchor. I picked up the rag and began to wipe down the weathered oak bar. There was a stubborn stain near the corner, a reminder of a battle fought and won. I didn't try to scrub it away. I just polished it until it shone in the starlight. The stars were finally visible through the thinning clouds of Obsidian 3, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just looking at them. I was part of them. I smiled, picked up a fresh ceramic bowl, and began to prep the soup for tomorrow.